Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cocktail Hour at Time of the Writer Festival 2022, the 25th year of this literary festival, coming to you from my hometown, Durban, although I'm currently in Johannesburg. That's my new town. And of course, coming to you from Durban, which has also been named UNESCO City of Literature. So we're talking today about a very special theme related to the festival theme, Beyond Words, Memory, Imagination, Conscience. And that topic today is, can we reimagine the future? To help me unpack this, I'm joined today by Dr. Ralph Mathekga and Malcolm Ray. These two are both political economy, political pundits, and I'm going to ask them to really turn their prophetic gaze onto South Africa and into the future of South Africa to give us a little bit of an understanding of what the prospects might be, both in terms of politics and economics for our country. A brief introduction to them both. Dr. Ralph Mathekga is one of South Africa's leading political analysts. He taught politics at the University of the Western Cape and worked as a senior policy analyst at National Treasury. He's often quoted by local and international media and comments regularly on radio and TV. He's the author of the bestseller When Zuma Goes and holds a PhD in politics. He's also written a book called Ramaphosa's Turn, Can Cyril Save South Africa? But his latest book is the one we're most interested in, The ANC's Last Decade, How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. Malcolm Ray is a former anti-apartheid activist, award-winning journalist, editor, and academic with a special interest in political economy. He's contributed to several books and written journal and magazine articles covering politics, economics, and business. His latest book, the one we're most interested in, is The Tyranny of Growth. It's a modern epic that exposes the lie of economic growth and provocatively recounts how the 2008 global financial meltdown and the COVID-19 pandemic have become the leading cause of governments and multilateral institutions' global and spectacular failure. It brilliantly explains how a single number, GDP, came to have such bewildering power over our lives, despite its ruinous consequences. But ultimately, the book strives to illuminate a new way of imagining the world. He's also written a book called Free Fall, Why South African Universities Are in a Race Against Time. And about a decade ago, he wrote, maybe somewhat presciently seeing that we're seeing a war in Eastern Europe, he wrote a book called The Black Oligarchs, Power and Wealth Since the End of Apartheid. Welcome to you both, Malcolm and Ralph. Ralph, I'd like to start with you. I'm just reading a little excerpt or blurb about your book here, as I did with Malcolm's. For nearly 3 decades, the ANC has held South Africa's politics in an iron grip, with the party seemingly at war with itself and President Ramaphosa battling to rein in corrupt cadres. Ralph Mathekga has predicted that the ANC will fall below the critical 50% threshold before the end of this decade. The decline of the ANC, which has been in power for almost 3 decades, could bring political reform, but it could also bring lots of uncertainty. If the ANC loses power, who will be in charge? Who or what will come after the ANC, and how will this affect South Africa? Over to you, Ralph.
Yeah, thanks, Ayesha. Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Malcolm. Great pleasure to be also sharing the stage with you. Ayesha, I've been battling with this question about how South Africans are captured by the ANC, the imagination. The theme of this is about reimagining the future, but you can never imagine the future if you are not even clear about the past, because the past actually set the groundwork. Give me the ground to stand on, I will move the world, Archimedes said. And I think the difficulty here in South Africa is, can we actually imagine the political future without the ANC? But it's not just the ANC. The ANC goes beyond just a political party. It represents a particular political culture. It represents a particular episode in our history. So what I often ask myself is to turn the question upside down and say that can South Africans survive without a strong political party that is holding at the center? Because that is what the ANC has been about to them. And when I look at the ANC, academics have predicted this thing. And I think that's why I enjoy this world of one foot in academia and one foot also with Malcolm on the other side, journalist who taught me how to write for people. And one thing that comes out here is that you do have a prediction that actually says liberation parties are going to last for about 30 years. From there, they will have to engage in extraordinary measures to stay in power. We know what's going on up north. And in South Africa, we have not actually entertained that idea so much, Ayesha, until when we start to see the cracks within the ANC, particularly under Zuma. And we move away from that exceptionalism that, oh my God, it looks like it's happening the same way here. So it's not tragic. It's not a huge miracle. What I think it's a problem is us getting to the idea that we can exist without a dominant party such as the ANC. I'm telling you, even the most Democrats in this country, I hear them whispering, we need a strong party. And then I say that democracy is about uncertainty with some level of predictability. And can we live under that? It's not just the ANC that will find itself out of power in trouble. It looks as if we ourselves are going to struggle to deal with the political community whereby we don't have anyone who is dominating us. Can we shift from that political culture? That's what I've been battling with here. And I think it's happening faster than we are admitting. Our psychology is a little bit lagging, whereas the reality of where we are now, you look at the ANC now, it's not in charge in metropolitan cities in Johannesburg. I mean, but the country is not actually burning. So somewhere, somehow, it's already happening, but we find it difficult to accept that, to imagine that kind of a future, because it looks tragic to the political future that we had in mind in relation to the ANC.
Interesting, Ralph. Particularly your question about whether we can survive without that sort of strong hand on us from government. But also, as you've pointed out, many of the country's metros are no longer in ANC hands, and we're surviving. The citizens of those metropoles are surviving. So despite the fact that we don't have a party in opposition that in many people's minds is untainted by the past. Your point also about the ANC's loss of the urban vote and its maintaining a fairly strong hold still, I think, on the rural vote is something I'd like to explore later going forward in this. But thank you for that introduction. Malcolm, from your viewpoint, anything you'd like to say about what Ralph has said, and then take us a little bit into your book, please.
Well, maybe I'll come back to what Ralph has said when we talk specifically about South Africa. Perhaps let me introduce my book first, if I may. So I began writing this book in early March last year, and essentially, around that time, it was during a lockdown in South Africa. And the thing that occurred to me was that there was clearly a kind of a pre-existing awareness among people about issues related to climate and so on, a growing awareness, certainly since the Paris Accord. And that was heightened during the kind of the ruinous Trump fiasco in the United States, his presidency. There was that, but what struck me was that, I think for the first time, people were starting to see, and I mean people generally, not just a conscious kind of activist core, were starting to see the contours of a humanitarian, a global humanitarian crisis during the pandemic. But what was deeply unsatisfying for me was the sort of public discourse going around within governments, not just the South African government, but governments around the world, and within the media establishment. And I think to a large extent, academia was silent for the initial phase of the pandemic. It was only later that we began to see some papers coming out. But I felt that and against this background, against that background, by the way, was a kind of treatise that Klaus Schwab from the WEF had written several months prior, which was, I think, around June 2020. And that it was a short book, about 120 pages, called The Great Reset, which I found troublesome, and for a person who isn't, clued up on economics, and certainly the WEF's history, he could quite easily have gotten away with the kind of stuff that he was saying there. He was essentially talking about a new normal that the COVID pandemic had created an opportunity for, and essentially that new normal was really about labor substitution. It was really about increasing the rate of capital intensity, and in the context of COVID, this was something that many companies, in particular the platform corporations, the Amazons and so on, latched onto. And so I felt that a challenge was necessary in two fronts. One was the kind of discourse going on within governments, and the other was the treaties that Schwab had written. I felt that what the pandemic was doing really was magnifying a pre-existing crisis that, in a sense, sort of had grown during 2007, 2008, when the financial meltdown hit. None of those issues were resolved. If you recall, what the US had done was it simply bailed out the culprits, and introduced typically, which is what happened during the pandemic also, kind of neo-Keynesian measures to manage money supply. So, I decided, and interestingly, the theme of this conference, of this festival is memory. I felt that it was necessary in order to deal with the kind of issues, the sort of almost this whirlpool of issues that started to sort of almost accost me. I felt it was necessary to deal with this issue substantially. So rather than look at the problem as a COVID-specific problem, I felt that I wanted to look at the kind of framing of the problem, and whether in tackling what became a kind of concern about the impact of the pandemic on growth and therefore lives and livelihoods, instead of dealing with it as a straightforward lives versus livelihoods sort of debate, or growth versus livelihoods debate, I thought that I wanted to look at the doctrine, the governing kind of almost principle of what we've come to accept as a growth economy. And so, I decided to do that historically, by going back in time, by tracing the origins of growth. And the thing about memory is that it can often be, when it's retrospective, it can be selective. And when it's selective, it can be embedded in a sense in the kind of stuff that becomes myth. And through that process, what you have emerging is various schools of falsification and mythology. So, I wanted to kind of revisit the origins of growth and look at it through an entirely different lens, and in the process challenge the neoclassical convention within which the growth doctrine is cast. And so, in a sense, the book is a sort of, if you like, it's a process of historical layering. And as I put it to a journalist yesterday, I use the metaphor of an onion. It's like kind of, in a sense, journeying to the core of the onion, and then delayering the onion, in a sense, in order to understand how it grew. It was the same kind of almost thing with the research process with this book. It was basically a matter of tracing the origins of growth, and then figuring out how it became the Frankenstein monster that it is today.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Malcolm. Lots to think about there. It strikes me as quite apt that you've used that onion metaphor. The last time I heard that one used was when Thomas Piketty was here to do the Nelson Mandela Foundation lecture. And he used a very similar metaphor of sort of unpeeling that onion of growth and the growth economy. So it strikes me as particularly apt, particularly because we're, so the pundits say, about to enter a new depression, even a sort of post-COVID depression. And hopefully we can talk a bit more about that later. Coming back to you, Ralph, in terms of what you said about our party political landscape, and perhaps piggybacking on what Malcolm has said about the global growth economy or the global economic landscape, anything particularly you would like to add to that? And specifically coming from this idea that we may not have an ANC in power for very much longer. We don't seem to have too many options in terms of strong man or strong party politics. So where does that leave us on both the political front as well as on the economic front? Because the ANC over its almost 30-year trajectory in South Africa in government has very much bought into that neoclassical economics model. It was accused very early on of talking left and walking right. So would you like to come in there, Ralph?
Yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by what Malcolm is saying there, and I think it's a very interesting perspective. I mean, if you look at South Africa, you look at the story in South Africa. I mean, the story of growth, it's actually not working. I mean, it's becoming difficult to sell growth, and there is this idea that we are where we are because we have abandoned what are called the fundamentals. We need reforms. Sometimes I don't even know what people mean by reforms, Malcolm, what they're referring to as reforms, because it can be very embarrassing to disagree sometimes on these things. Sometimes you just go along. I mean, if you look at that, you look at how the story goes in South Africa, and I think the big story in South Africa is about the distribution of growth. I mean, it's about the capacity of the state. It's about ability to come up with policies that are going to actually affect that distribution of growth. I mean, you're pointing out to Piketty the emphasis he's making in his book. Actually, it's about, he's actually saying you can change things by wage distribution more so than by just growth. I mean, South Africa has attained growth in the past, but it has not actually being redistributed in a way that it has affected the society positively. And sometimes you feel this thing coming out, and it feels, you feel you are crazy, because sometimes these ideas are put out, Malcolm, as if they are over discussive, like they're settled, it's growth. We all agree it has to be about growth. Whereas actually we know that where we have a problem is the greater weakness in capacity when it comes to policy within the state, ability to actually use the state machinery to deal with the question of concentration in South Africa's economy, which is what we are not talking about. And I think at the end of the day, you have political parties that are not able to connect with the people more practically. You've got the party that is quite ideological, people can understand, but it has got zero capacity. But you also have some other parties that are showing potential when it comes to capacity, which is the DA, for example. But it does not have the ability to connect with the people and give the people the services with dignity, because political service is not just about providing water and all that, Ayesha. I mean, if it was about that, we could hire companies to do that, but it's also about doing that by involving people in a way that you restore that dignity. This is where I think the problem is that we are not going to find any political party that rebuilds that center in South Africa. I think the future of South Africa's politics, the way in which I see it, is that of fragmentation. You are no longer going to have any party that can reconstruct the center. And I can assure you, each and every election, in the next 3 or 4 elections, you're going to have a new kid on the block, which is an indication of that level of fragmentation of what is happening. Is because I don't know. I think I don't know whether Ayesha should say the intellectual output from political parties is poor. I don't know whether parties are no longer engaging in concepts. It's more about, I mean, you look at the snazzy messages that party come through sometimes when they go to election, Malcolm, it can be all hands on deck. I mean, it sounds nice, but what? Or is it based on what principles of economic intervention? So I'm fascinated when you're going back to some of these principles to say, let's go back and revisit growth. The growth that we are talking about in South Africa, yes, we can attain it, but it tends to be concentrated at that top and it gets redistributed quite badly. Can we come up with more benign intervention policies that are going to redistribute better? Under the ANC, is it possible? I really think that at some point we should acknowledge if a party is genuinely failing. There is nothing sinister. All of these things of corruption sometimes are symptoms, but they could just be genuine failure. People could just simply be out of their depth when it comes to putting together a cogent policy framework that can actually work for this type of society.
Mm.
Ralph, I think you've put your finger on that to a large degree of why the ANC might well be perceived to be failing, and it's not just about the Zuma era and state capture, etc. Of course, that played into it, but it hasn't been able to visibly pull itself out of that and lead us back towards the ideal that the ANC once stood for, of a politics of not just of growth, but of development. And as you've so rightly said, we've seen growth at times, but we've also seen at the same time a deepening of inequality, a deepening of poverty, that dreaded Gini coefficient, which South Africa knows so well and exhibits so well in all the worst senses. But it also speaks a little bit, I think, to things like what government is willing or unwilling to do in the political economy. Malcolm, you spoke about, the US bailouts of the big companies and banks, etc. We've seen SOE bailouts of state-owned enterprises repeatedly in this country. And we now have at the helm of that ministry somebody who was previously our finance minister. And it's a bit ironic that Mr. Gordon now has that job of trying to decide which, if any, of the SOEs are sustainable and rescuable, and how to go about doing that, and what kind of economic considerations need to be taken into account to avoid throwing bad money after good. Malcolm?
Yeah. I think my take on this, I just want to come at it from a slightly different angle, I guess, and not looking specifically at any particular SOE or government department or individual in government, because I think that the kind of the problem or the crisis of the ruling African National Congress and the government it leads resolves itself. And here I want to be, very clear. I mean, I think we should, steer sort of away from idealizing the ANC. There's this kind of tendency to romanticize the ANC's history. I come from a tradition in the 80s, where I was part of a socialist current inside COSATU, called the Workers' Internationalist League, and I can tell you that the kind of experience of that period when the ANC was still in exile, and some of the kind of policies that the party has adopted today suggests some discontinuities, but on the whole, there are continuities. Okay, so the tradition is more or less the same in terms of policy. And here what I'm saying is that the ANC is a party of business. We've got to be clear about that. It has always been a party with a middle-class leadership, in a sense, with a largely poor base or working-class base. That continues today. And I think what's important here is a kind of characterization of the party in order to understand its policies and some of the policy contradictions that it's struggling to navigate. The kind of decline, if you like, over the past, 10 years in particular, but this decline began soon after GEAR, in fact. No sooner than GEAR was adopted, we started to see splinter unions within COSATU forming, the Transport and General Workers Union, the Chemical Workers Industrial Union, the Food and Allied Workers Union, splinter unions starting to form, but they were small and negligible, and in a sense, they didn't get media attention, right? And it certainly didn't at that time demonstrate a phenomenon. So it wasn't something taken up in academia, but it was happening, and the rumblings were there, and there were challenges against GEAR. There were challenges against the growth doctrine that the ANC had adopted. There were challenges against neoclassical economics. There were challenges against neoliberalism. That's what they were. Okay, and they grew in intensity until Marikana. I guess that for me, Marikana represented a sort of decisive break, because the ANC, when that happened, the ANC prior to that could claim a model mission, right? It had a model, almost a model high ground. It could claim a liberation tradition, and it could still claim a model tradition. I think that what Marikana had done was essentially, it was so decisive that it unmoored the ANC from any possible claim to morality, right? And I think it signaled the beginnings of more deeper fissures and fractures inside the ruling party. I think that in a sense, so I just want to shift the arc a little bit. I think that the real battleground, and Ralph is right, is social and economic. Okay, the real battleground in South Africa is social and economic, and to understand this, I think we need to, characterize the class project of the ANC and how that project is sublimated by the lived experience of the poor. And I want to suggest that any characterization of the ANC must first of all start with the primary goal of the party, the primary policy goal of the party, which since 1994, and certainly since 1996, has been a kind of a neoclassical growth goal, and the construction of a black elite against the radical yearnings of its traditional, predominantly poor and working class support base, right? So, the ANC's policy course, certainly since 1996, right, has been fairly consistent. It's been a policy course that has arced over a growth doctrine mediated by Black economic empowerment as the sort of organizing framework of or for economic and social transformation in South Africa. And in that sense, I think the party leadership is, I started out talking about the contradictions that it's navigating. I think the party leadership is navigating, and it doesn't matter who that leadership is, by the way, whether that leadership was the Mbeki leadership or the Zuma leadership, or currently the Ramaphosa leadership. It has and is still navigating multi-layered and multifaceted contradictions within a deeply unequal society. I mean, you pointed out that our Gini coefficient is among the worst in the world. And that's starting to take the form of a kind of, well, it started a while back, actually, to take the form of a kind of deracialized corporate hierarchy of power, right, on the one side, and essentially black, a black poor support base on the other. So in the face of all of this, you know, President Ramaphosa in his SONA address earlier, you know, demonstrated a complete bankruptcy of ideas. Other than vague references to a mixed economy, I'm not sure whether people pick that up, whatever that means these days, and a sort of quick hopscotch through the economic policies it's adopted since the Ready to Govern document. And by the way, that hopscotch, you know, it was a skip over gear. Gear wasn't mentioned. Every other policy document was mentioned but gear, which is ironic in a sense. So the South African leadership challenge can be described as an ideological and economic policy challenge of growth linked to the distributional effects of Black economic empowerment. And it isn't, and I think this is this is an important point I want to make here. I think it isn't that both have failed, right? It's actually, in some respects, that they've actually worked, just not in the interest of the poor. Growth has driven B and vice versa in exactly the way the policies are designed. And let's be clear, B, despite its broad-based pretensions, through its various iterations, has always been an elite agenda principally focused on the transfer of ownership and control from an old elite bloc, an old oligarchy, a racial oligarchy, more recently the state, to an emerging one. Initially, that was during the Mbeki periods in the 90s through private sector deals, through private compacts, and elite pacting. And then since I think about 2010, when Jacob Zuma was president, through a progressive hollowing out of the states by a kind of emerging oligarchy around that time at different levels of government and across different spheres of government. So, that's my characterization, just building on Ralph's comment and yours, Ayesha. That's my take in terms of what I think is a necessary characterization, but also theorization of what's going on. And I mean, I think there are really complex issues, that we can't just, I think that require interpretation. I mean, the question of the state, for example, hasn't been properly characterized in relation to growth and the growth doctrine. And the state is a constitutive force of all kinds of things, including, nation building, social cohesion, growth. In the ANC's, was rather in government, I must distinguish between the two. In the context of government policy, the massive push for public sector, public works programs. And then more recently, a massive push for a social wage, given the levels of poverty and the impact of COVID. It's important to get a sense of the state as both a subject and an object of change, right? It's dissimulation at different levels and spheres of government actually mirrors the fracturing of society into competing interests, that are tenuously held together by the hegemony of the ANC. And here I want to suggest that, the weakening of the ANC's authority, and Ralph has written about this countless times, and in his latest book, the weakening of that authority is being complemented by competing factions. And these factions are driven by elites tugging at different levels of state power for influence and resources. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of just rambling on. I'll stop there.
No, I think it's really important. Thank you, Malcolm. So we're dealing with a ruling party that's grappling with policy contradictions, grappling with internal fissures and fractures that, as you've said, and as Ralph has said, mirrors or reflects the fractionalization of society itself, South African society itself. So coming back then to our topic, and I want to post this out to you while I read out a comment that's come up on from Facebook, but coming back to our topic then, how can we reimagine the future? We have, as you've pointed out, Malcolm, pretty moribund leadership. You've pointed out that Marikana was a watershed moment in many respects, both for our polity and our political economy. Looking at all of that, how does one reimagine going forward? How do we fill this leadership vacuum, for one? What kind of economy can we envisage in 5-10 years' time? Is there any kind of succession plan within any of the political parties? We've seen in recent days, some resignations from opposition parties as well, with a fairly blistering letter written by one such resignee, somebody who seems very resigned to the kind of opposition politics we have here, and is no longer wanting to participate in them. So what kind of South Africa can we reimagine then, or imagine, and then start to reimagine in 5 to 10 years? I'd like you to think about that while I read out a comment. Shafinaz Hashim on Facebook says, the South African political psyche still seems to need to be guided by the pointing finger of the patriarch. And Ralph alluded to this. And even if it occurs on some kind of pendulum of reflexivity between rage and acquiescence, the dial still seems to point back at the need for an even flawed leader to do the work and show the way. And I think, again, Ralph, you pointed at this not only for our own situation, but also our neighbors to the north have experienced pretty much this kind of vacuum in terms of political leadership, in terms of the electorate's, for want of a better word, and I know it will anger some, apathy to the kind of leaders, the kind of politicians, the kind of parliament as our legislators that we've voted into power and put into power in various ways, and even those that we've put into power indirectly, into economic power, through that enrichment of a very narrow band of elites, to the detriment of most of the rest of the society, certainly the majority. So Ralph, if you'd like to come in there.
Okay. Thanks, Ayesha. I think that we are actually doing better than we think about ourselves. I mean, I'm saying this, Ayesha, because every time when you look at the discourse on South Africa's politics, it's always about leadership. And I think if you narrow the ANC to a question of maybe they can bump into a good leader, you are failing to point out what Malcolm was pointing out, the history of this party, that some of the problems that they're dealing with, they're actually genuine. I don't think they genuinely know how to deal with state-owned entities. I mean, the big problem is, how do you let go of the policy lever such as that? But again, your party is not strong enough because you have got groups that have taken over, that have actually infiltrated the transformation agenda or project of the party here. The thing with the NC's model is that it does not anticipate infiltration from within. It always has a sense of an enemy from outside. So those are some of the genuine problems. And when you look at a party such as that, that's why every morning we want better leaders and so forth. But when you look at it, we need to go into the institutions. And if you look at what's happening on the ground, there is a lot that has been achieved by ordinary South Africans who did not pronounce on their political project. I'll point to a simple example. I mean, we have had a very important court judgment, which is what I mentioned in the book, actually. A court judgment about electoral law that actually says that it is unconstitutional that someone who does not have a political party cannot be allowed to stand. And what I think is so humbling, Ayesha, about this story is that we are not telling about the people behind this. I mean, the people who were behind this story, Malcolm, are simple people. I met them at Oxfam, and they were saying that, look, we cannot eat the Constitution. And I remember saying to them, well, one day the poor are going to learn how to litigate, because the Constitution, South Africa's Constitution, is very powerful. I don't think anyone, maybe now, of course, it reflects the power balance in the society, Malcolm. The rich will always go for their own agenda. But what I've seen in terms of this litigation on electoral reform, two people, unassuming, pro bono case, no special interest whatsoever, actually. I mean, I can say personally that I remember meeting some of the two guys in Midrand. They'll put together coins for coffee. I'm not saying that a struggle has to have that a face of poverty, but what I'm saying is that very unassuming characters who went to the court and said to the court, how about if people stand as independent candidates? And the court said, we think you have an idea, just like that. And the court then nullified the law. What that means is that it shows us something, that some of the great political developments in our society will not come through people with huge political projects. The NGOs are doing amazing work in litigating on social justice. Look at how the NGO litigation has actually shaped a public health in South Africa. And we need to stop and say the world's biggest ARV is not because government thought it was a good thing. It's because someone out there within a small NGO said that, how about we provide that? And government resisted, and it went to court to a point where the biggest public health intervention came to be. So for me, as much as we need good leaders, there is a lot that has been done by South Africa that has driven society so far. And it has been done by people who don't jump on roof of houses to sing and asking for their praises to be sang. It has been done by ordinary people, case by case, social justice. Look at the environmental case happening now, and it is going to drive our environmental laws in that direction. So for me, one thing that I'm very proud about this society is that an ordinary person, an ordinary woman from elsewhere can actually come up with a case that actually change the shape of the laws of this country, and the leaders then come and jump. And I think that is a very good thing. We should sing praise to those people. We should look at those litigation by the NGOs, those small litigation on an ongoing basis. They have done a lot in changing this society. And for me, Ayesha, I'd rather spend a day writing down the group of people who have succeeded in that than enumerating leadership. Despite Malcolm spending so much pages on leadership, those are the people I think who we should really appreciate in South Africa. They've done a lot.
Ralph is someone who comes from an NGO background myself. I couldn't agree with you more. I do think we have a very vibrant, and we're lucky to have a very vibrant civil society in this country. But so too did, for example, Zimbabwe 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So too did Mozambique for a long time. The examples abound. And so, yes, I think really we should be very, very grateful that we've been blessed with such active civil society players who actually do litigate on our behalf when our legislators don't appear to be too willing to reform laws that don't work in the interests of the majority. But having said that, and looking specifically at the electoral law reform, that case that you mentioned, it's all very well to say, well, yes, independents can stand on their own. But given the current landscape, the political landscape we have and the political system we have, do we then need to take a re-look at that political system? Do we need to go back perhaps even as far as the old Slabbert report, which, as far back as, almost 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, postulated that the best way forward for South Africa would be some form of mixed member system with a degree of proportional representation, but also some direct representation, and allowing for individuals standing and not just a party system. We've seen that Lesotho has flirted with that kind of political system to some extent with mixed results, a mixed member system with mixed results. So, what's the way forward for us in terms of our political system and our current so-called parliamentary, two-tier parliamentary democracy? Is there something more we should be looking at designing into that system, Ralph? And while you think about that, Malcolm, do you have anything to say in response to Shafinaz's comment and in response to Ralph's as well?
What was that comment again? Ayesha? Just repeat the comment, please.
I'm repeating the comment for you. The South African political psyche still seems to be need to be guided by the pointing finger of the patriarch. And even if this occurs on some pendulum of reflexivity between rage and acquiescence, the dial still seems to point back at the need for an even flawed leader. So for even a flawed leader to do the work and show the way, almost seeming to characterize the populace as needing to be guided, needing to be directed, and not having too much or taking up too much agency. And then there's another message that's just come in from Nazima Adam on Facebook. It seems unfair, but I have to agree with Ralph. South Africa is in the hands of the citizens on the ground, and more especially in the hands of good Samaritans with kindness in their hearts. It begs the question, why are we paying taxes and rates and? In other words, almost advocating for opting out of the formal tax system and just going to philanthropy directly.
So two important points, and I'll try to answer them in but marrying them almost. Firstly, I think that we should never, ever settle for something subpar. So you have a problem. For example, there's massive anxiety in South Africa today about what happens when, and Ralph, this is your next book, when Ramaphosa goes, right? Why should we be grappling with investing energy in inane questions like that? When I was talking earlier, I said that we should be moving away from personality politics and leadership corps and so on, and looking at I think more deeply at the problem or problems firstly, and then agency. The discussion that's been happening now by yourself, by Ralph, agency, very important. What is the role of civil society? What is the role of what in the late 90s started to emerge as a new social movement in South Africa? And what is the role of individuals? I think in a sense the leadership thing, the kind of debate that's been happening around that, if it is a debate, on one level has been hobbled by an obsession with factionalism and individual personalities, all trying to fill a political space that opened up after Mbeki's removal, right? And remember that the ANC did not tolerate dissent in exile, and it certainly didn't tolerate dissent when it became a ruling party after 1994 in South Africa within its ranks. It functioned on the principle of democratic centralism, which effectively meant that once a position is taken, members follow. You shut up and you follow or get out. So if you contested, you could be expelled. So no contestation. And so I think that the question of who, of how we grapple with leadership and what we settle for ultimately is a larger question of how we grapple, and I don't think that we've begun to do this in serious and intelligent ways, with the kind of real underlying problems and challenges that we confront in South Africa. And I know that what people tend to bandy about is the nexus between corruption on the one side and factionalism on the other side, and how the two, in a sense, have come together, over the years. And I want to suggest that in grappling with the problem before we move to answers and how we move forward and leadership issues moving forward, is I want to suggest that actually I want to come at this differently. I want to suggest that the ANC's managed to actually, if it has been losing support and if there is a crisis at leadership level, it's actually managed to retain a support base and something bordering on, and it's only bordering on hegemony at this point in time, because of corruption, not the other way around. In other words, because it is a party in power, in control of the state and its resources, it has little else to lure the poor to its ranks, certainly not its policies, okay, which are neoliberal to the core, despite some of the more kind of progressive, the left speak that happens in Sona speeches, and that gets embroidered into policy documents like the NDP, notions of a developmental state and so on. It is a neoliberal economic document. So it's certainly not the policy of the ANC that lures the poor to its ranks. It's certainly not its delivery track record, which is appalling. The reality is that the ANC since '96, when it adopted GEAR, it's been, and I think more intensely after the fall of Mbeki, it's been managing a crisis, or rather, it's been navigating a set of contradictions that it's tried to temper over the past 3 decades by playing up its historical mission as a party of national liberation and talking left. And now with the state firmly in its hands, the difference today, as opposed to the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, is that the state is firmly in its hands. It's able to more easily dispense patronage and use the state to distribute largesse. And I think, in a sense, in my interpretation of the problem, is this has become part of its literal machinations for reproducing power, right? So I think one's got to come to terms with the kind of complexity of the kind of tensions that are playing out inside the ruling party, right? And then the kind of policy challenges that overlay that. In order to sort of understand what prospects for a new leadership and what agency for a way forward, whether that agency is within the state or it's outside the state, whether it's within the ruling party or outside the ruling party, and so whether it's within civil society and something like a new social movement is the bigger question. But I certainly don't think, Ayesha, to come back to the comment, and question raised by the first person, that opting for anything like a subpar alternative is an option for us in South Africa. It isn't, and I think that the net effect of everything that has happened over the past 2 decades, the incremental fracturing of the ANC, the rising levels of corruption, the kind of waning of the sort of unifying ethos of its liberation tradition and its modelizing mission. Two things it's relied on. All these things, are rooted in a simple maybe a sort of proposition that I maybe want to make. It seems to me that the kind of internal machinations of reproducing power, plus the internal contradictions in the ANC, beyond liberation, that have emerged from the transfer of the legacy of inequality from the apartheid origins to Black economic empowerment, actually. This pattern of development is fashioning it initially started to fashion a subsidiary sort of Black and hegemonic white elite bloc on one level, right? It's now fashioning a kind of almost a superficial, as I said earlier, deracialized hierarchy of power.
Yes.
Kind of corporate hierarchy of citizens.
I'm asking you to round up because we've got about 2 minutes left.
Oh, I see. I didn't realize time had passed. Sorry, what was the question?
No, I said round off that thought, and then I'll go off to Ralph for some last words, and we're going to have to round off very quickly. There are a couple of other comments that I'd like to just read out and acknowledge as well.
Yeah. Okay. So what I see is in a sense the challenge rests with building leadership among people who have been othered, what Frans Fanon called the non-citizen citizens. So if you speak about a corporate hierarchy of citizens on one level, it's the non-citizen citizens. And if anybody tells me that organic intellectuals within the ranks of the working class and the poor are incapable of understanding, grasping, problems, then I would get very angry, because these are people that I grew up with in politics, during the 80s. Brilliant minds, organic intellectuals that emerged from the ranks of civil society. So we should move away from the kind of arrogance of leadership, either inherited leadership, what Ralph once called the royalty in the ANC. If you carry a name like Sisulu, then you become a logical contender. Or, people who are perceived to have the necessary qualifications to lead the party. We should be looking at people who are outside and almost building a movement with capable leadership outside of the ANC. And I think that the important thing, and thing that I'd like to kind of almost impart to listeners here, is that the important challenge for all of us is not how one either preserves the ANC or dislodges it from power, okay? Or how one kind of manages a new succession process, but how one creates or builds a counter narrative at grassroots level, on the ground, within civil society, that becomes a guarantee.
We're going to have to leave it there. So I like that, building a counter narrative at grassroots level within civil society. Thank you, Malcolm. Ralph, over to you for some last words. And before I do that, Warren Nebe says on Facebook, ordinary people deeply invested in our constitution, small projects and initiatives, and radical educators will transform the country. So I think very much agreeing with you, Malcolm and Ralph earlier, a new project like Atravonia Circle is an example. And Surya Govender agrees. She says that, yes, I agree with Ralph, and active civil society is our strength, but the institutions must be held to account. Ralph, some last words from you before we close up, please.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thanks, Malcolm. It's been really great. I do think that, of course, it will help if we have good political leaders, but at the same time, I don't really think it is tragic, because I've seen nations that depend a lot on leaders. I don't think South Africa will in the future make the mistake that it has done in the past in terms of trusting leaders. So I have much great hope about the people and where we are going. So I'm very happy, and thanks to all.
Thank you so much, Ralph and Malcolm. I was hoping to get to, I'm glad we're ending on a positive note. I was hoping to get to the agency of our young people as embodied in the Fees Must Fall movements of a few years ago. I was hoping to also talk or touch on the widespread insurrection we saw last year, the looting in KZN, etc. But as always, time is our enemy, but certainly some thoughts to leave our listeners and viewers with. So thank you very much to you both, Ralph and Malcolm. And to the audience out there, please go out and buy the books. The ANC's Last Decade and what that will mean for South Africa. So how the decline of the party will transform South Africa, to give it its proper subtitle. That's Dr. Ralph Mathega's book, The ANC's Last Decade, How the Decline of the Party Will Transform South Africa. And Malcolm Ray's The Tyranny of Growth. Go out there, read them, get the discussion going in your local communities with your friends and families, students, elders, youngers. And let's keep South Africa talking about these things and hopefully acting positively on the basis of learning and talking about them. Thank you both. Thank you to everybody out there who facilitated and participated in this panel. So those behind the scenes like Wesley, Sibahle, Amanda, thank you all, Noshe, thank you all for your very hard work behind the scenes, to Ismail Mohammed for a fantastic 25th edition of Time of the Writer Festival, which, as I said, comes to you from the Center for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which is in my hometown, Durban, though I don't live there anymore, and Durban is also the UNESCO City of Literature, so very apt that Time of the Writer happens there. Thank you, everyone. This has been a fantastic panel, much food for thought, very rich, very deep, lots of reading and thinking to do for all of us, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thanks, Malcolm. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to everybody too. Thanks, Ayesha.
Siyabonga kakhulu. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful